July 11th is the most important day in UFC history, and here's why. Two of the biggest cards in UFC history happened on this day 5 years apart, the first being UFC 189, the second being UFC 251, Usman versus Masvidal. UFC 189 was supposed to be headlined by Jose Aldo, but instead, Chad Mendes stepped in because Aldo was hurt due to a bruised rib. And to be honest, this was a pretty stacked card. Had some big names on it, like Cody Garbrandt making a second UFC appearance. Conor McGregor's teammate Katal Pendred was on the card as well. Mike Quick Swick also made an appearance. The featured prelim on the bout was Matt Brown versus Tim Means. And then you had Drew Pickett, Thomas Almeida in a pretty viral KO. Gunnar Nelson versus Brandon Thatch, Colorado native. Jeremy Stevens, Dennis Bermudez had an amazing fight that was up until probably one of the greatest fights in UFC history happened, Rory MacDonald versus Robbie Lawler. These dudes fought like they've never ever had money in their account before, and it showed because it ended in extremely devastating fashion in favor for Robbie Lawler, so much so that it was inducted to the UFC Hall of Fame. Now, with Aldo being out, people were wondering if the UFC could still generate ticket sales, and boy oh boy did they ever do that.
Listen, can you help us understand from a business perspective the metrics and things that you guys track? What has changed either positively or negatively since the fight changed?
So you've seen our ticket sales. Our ticket sales are now at $7.1 million. So congratulations to all you guys making this the biggest event in the history of the UFC for Las Vegas and the United States. Our pay-per-view pre-buys, John, are through the roof. This is on pace to set big records. And in addition to that, all the metrics that we use, web traffic is up double and triple in most instances over the next biggest event this year and last year. So this is a big event. And then we have over 16,000 fans expected into the arena on Saturday. Sunday tickets are selling well, and we're going to have a record crowd at the Expo.
Because Conor was still on the card, it was the first and only time that actual artists sung out the fighters to the octagon. And seeing it live was insane. This is how I'm going to remember Conor's career. Then the fight happened, and it was probably one of the best two-round fights you could ever see, because the stigma of Conor's career at this point was he never fought a wrestler, and Chad Mendes was a pretty good wrestler at the time. How would he stop that? Well, he stopped it by rearranging his own facial features in the second round with the insane KO to make him the interim UFC featherweight champion, and a star was born that night, so much so that it sold 1 million pay-per-view buys, which is a record at the time. Now let's fast forward 5 years, and the year is 2020, and we're all going through it. Everyone is locked down. There's nowhere to go, nothing to watch. Never fear, the UFC is here. However, Gilbert Burns had COVID, but also never fear, Miami Jesus is here. Jorge Masvidal was there to step in and fight on 6 days' notice. Jorge was the biggest star in 2020 at that point because of the year he had previous. It was the only option. You also had Piotr Jan versus Jose Aldo fight for the vacant bantamweight title. Then you had probably one of the most controversial fights to ever grace the octagon, Max Holloway versus Volkanovski 2. So many people were talking about that fight after it happened. Then you had the lackluster fight between Kamaru Usman and Jorge Masvidal, where Kamaru Usman just foot stomped him to death. But we all knew it was for a good reason. Jorge did not have a training camp. But this card drew so much eyes, 1.3 million people purchased the event on pay-per-view. You know what else makes these events eerily similar besides them being on the same day and 5 years apart? Was the fact that both of the main events had to pull out. Both of them were also Brazilian. But in the end, on paper at least, or for one instance at least, UFC 189, we got a better main event. Whereas for UFC 251, the main event was so lackluster that everybody wanted their money back. But nonetheless, this was such big events for the UFC because of where the sport was at that time. They were still trying to get new fans both of those times. In 2015, Conor McGregor captured the audience of millions. People had no idea what MMA was, what even UFC was at that time. Then in 2020, we had the pandemic. We had everybody staying indoors. No other sports were on during that time other than the UFC. So why not put on the biggest fight we can make at that time? And that was Jorge Masvidal versus Kamaru Usman. And it was the first pay-per-view to get 1 million buys since Khabib versus McGregor, because that's how many people knew Jorge Masvidal. That's how many people knew this was a big fight was because he was a part of it, albeit he took it on 6 days notice. So the fact that the UFC put that card together, it helped them get more fans at a time where the sport could have went either way. It could have sank or it swam, and it definitely swam. And watching Conor McGregor fight live against Chad Mendes, watching all those Irish people waving their flags, singing, chanting, watching Sinead O'Connor perform, I don't think I've ever had a rush like that ever in my life. And all I know is I don't think any other star can create the type of buzz that Conor McGregor generated back in 2015 on this day 10 years ago. It's just impossible. We've seen it happen already. Now everybody's just going to be trying to cosplay Conor. It's just a fact. And these 2 days saved the UFC. Even though the UFC wasn't in trouble during both times, but it catapulted them to being the true #1 sports leader as far as MMA in the entire planet. So much so that any other league that tries to form or that is already formed, it's dying. GFL, PFL, one championship. This is a reason why the UFC will always be #1, because they make fights like this. And because of July 11th, 2015 and July 11th, 2020, two of the best days in UFC history. Where were you when those fights happened? Let me know in the comment section.